Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Paymar, and you are listening to The Big Shift, the podcast that looks at the massive changes our world, our country, our politics, and our institutions are confronting. Today, we're investigating one of the most important issues this country faces, the right to vote. Voting is the backbone of American democracy, and it is threatened by the courts, including the Supreme Court, and state legislatures that are creating barriers for the American people to get to the polls. We have a special guest on The Big Shift today, Anne Ravel. Anne is an expert in the field of voting rights. She was the chair of the Federal Election Commission in Washington, D.C., was chair of the California Fair Political Practices Commission. She worked for the United States Department of Justice and was a professor at the UC Berkeley School of Law. Today, Anne travels the world speaking and serving on panels working to preserve the right to vote. Anne, welcome to The Big Shift.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Anne, first of all, in your view, are electoral rights truly under threat in America? Newspaper columnists, pundits on cable TV networks, as well as polls indicate we are backsliding on freedom, democracy, and the right to vote. Your view?
I absolutely agree that we are backsliding, not on all things, not necessarily freedom, but we can talk about that in a minute, but definitely with regard to the right to vote. And that's because, as you said, democracy is the power or rule by the people. But what we're now seeing is many states are attempting to suppress the vote, to prevent Black citizens and other minorities, as well as young people, from voting.
Yeah, it seems that states all across America, there's a movement afoot to disenfranchise millions of voters or to make voting so difficult that people don't go to the polls. Your thoughts on that?
That's correct. There have been 19 state legislatures that have passed laws, as you mentioned, to try to make it much more difficult for people to vote. On the other hand, and you talked about the courts, some of those cases are in the courts now. And while it is true that many of the courts are biased and are political themselves, there are also a lot of courts that have criticized some of the legislation, and that's true in Florida, where it's being looked at. Their bill to not allow people to do what's called warming, which is to give people food or water on the lines, but other ways of suppressing the vote. And the court in Florida essentially decided, that was a constitutional decision, that those acts by the legislature had no basis in any fact, as there being any kind of problems in these voting processes. And in fact, the court said the enactment of that law was done solely for the purpose of discrimination.
Well, what troubles me is, how did we get to the place where millions of Americans don't believe in the validity of our elections? They think they're fraudulent. I mean, today, roughly 1 in 3 Americans believe the 2020 election that Joe Biden won was stolen. How did we get here?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that we got here because Trump indicated after the election that he knew that it was fraudulent. And because that is then repeated on social media, it's repeated on TV, it's repeated by his allies, such as some of the more right-wing crazies, and many people believe the disinformation that is inflammatory, and that's how we got there.
But we've never been here before Trump.
No,
Is this a Trump phenomena?
I think the issue of validity of the elections and the both the fairness of the process as well as the counting, those are issues that people have never claimed were problematic. In fact, the United States has had really, really strong electoral processes, both in federal matters as well as local.
Yeah, but we're not talking like Humphrey Nixon, where there was just a very, very narrow window, or some of the other elections like Gore Bush that were very, very close. Biden won by 7 million votes, and the electoral count, which was certified by Congress and former Vice President Mike Pence, showed 306 votes for Biden and 232 for Trump. I mean, it's not like, there was this narrow window here.
That is correct. But when misinformation and lies are repeated over and over again by numerous individuals, whether it be on cable networks or online, people do not seem to understand what the real truth is, and they go along with these things that are clearly false.
Freedom House, which is a nonprofit organization, it was founded by none other than Eleanor Roosevelt. So they used a methodology derived from the United Nations, and it indicated that there was an 11-point decline in freedom in America from 2010 to 2020. And their report indicates it was driven by several factors: political corruption, conflicts of interest, lack of transparency in government, and punitive immigration and asylum policies. Do you agree with that assessment?
I agree with the assessment that there is democratic backsliding, and Freedom House determined that the United States went from being number 5 in democracy in the world to number 31 in 2017. And it coincided with the election of Trump once again, because also what we saw, and this is true in several other organizations that also look at issues of democracy around the world. In addition to what you mentioned, there was election interference by foreign countries during the 2016 election. There's been clearly a reduction in transparency in the government. And the real serious problem is that there were no checks and balances with regard to President Trump and how he acted as a president. And because of that, too, there were erosion of ethical norms by the president and his appointees, and in particular, the standards that have always existed, such as the president not interfering in the operations of the Department of Justice and other public agencies that are meant to protect the public and to protect our democracy. And also because he had an anti-immigrant and racist stance, and definitely conflicts of interest with regard to the actions that he took in his own self-interest.
Well, it was even like William Barr, the Attorney General. He was basically a tool of Donald Trump during this election process, and was echoing and mirroring everything Trump said, everything from deflating the Mueller report all the way down the line, marching with him when he held up a Bible in front of a church. I mean, they were collaborators.
Right. And that, having been in the Department of Justice, is definitely a violation of the norms of the Department of Justice, which when I was in the Obama administration during that time, it was very clear that the Department of Justice was an independent agency that had authority to look into criminal activity and also improper other kinds of activities, civil matters, but was not supposed to be in contact with the president because it's an independent agency.
Independence. And the other aspect that I find really frightening is that there have been numerous threats now, death threats against election workers, attorneys general, secretaries of state around the country. And you yourself have received death threats. Have you had death threats?
I did when I was at the Federal Election Commission. I've got probably close to 1,000 death threats when I suggested that what the federal election needed to do was to assure that the same laws that are applicable to newspapers and to television, where they have to identify who's behind campaign contributions, so that the public can know who's trying to influence the election, and that it should be also applicable to advertising on the internet. And because of that, one of my fellow commissioners went on Fox News to say that I was trying to censor the internet and to shut it down single-handedly.
Yeah, right. All by yourself, by your little lonesome. And who is behind this kind of intimidation, and how do we stop it? And why will people take the risk to work in the electoral process in the future?
Right. Well, let me start with that. Obviously, there are a lot of people who, and most of them, who are secretaries of state or who are local registrars of voters throughout the country, are people who really care about the democratic process. And yes, a number of them have decided to resign from office because they're afraid for their lives and they're getting such vitriol. But it's the only way to go forward. And fortunately, the Department of Justice, as well as the Election Assistance Commission, are both federal agencies, have tried to do things to protect the rights of the people who are working in the electoral process. It's still worrisome, though, because those threats are still continuing.
Well, the courts in many states also seem to be in the corner of the Republican Party. They're trying to suppress voting rights, early voting, mail-in voting. Those are both being stymied. And as you indicated earlier, there are people outside the polls who are trying to intimidate those who are trying to get inside to vote. I mean, how do we combat this effort and to keep people from going in and getting their legitimate democratic rights received by casting their ballot?
Right. Well, unfortunately, this has become typical of many states. As I said, there's 19 that have passed these laws, and many of them are ridiculous laws. And in most cases, the courts have not taken a lot of action to deal with that problem. It's not an easy answer. I mean, one of the problems that we have is that we do have a country, and I would suggest, I know this is a little off topic, but I would suggest there's a very recent article in the Atlantic magazine, which is the heading to the article is America faces a type of extremist violence it does not know how to stop. And it's also entitled The New Anarchy. And that is part of the problem. It's very difficult to deal with those kinds of issues if the courts are not going to be the backstop. And if it's, whether it be the local superior court or local Supreme Courts or even the US Supreme Court, which, as you indicated, are politically biased.
And how many hundreds of judges did Trump appoint that were kind of handed to him by the Federalist Society as being very right-wing and very conservative and taking on their agenda? But Ann, I got to ask you, right now, we have a Democrat in the White House, Democratic control in the Senate. What happens in your view if there's a power shift after the 2024 election and the Republicans gain back, let's say, both the White House and the Senate? They control the House now. I mean, what attacks might we see on voting rights?
I think they will be increased. It is really problematic to have essentially a one-party government. We know in other countries where that has existed, where for years there's always of one political party. Mexico is a good example of that. That has been consistently been elected, and then when the real people who care about everyone's having a voice in government, they changed it. The international, it's called the INE, the Electoral Authority in Mexico, changed it, and it moved to great democracy in Mexico. And that's what we're going to go back to, is exactly what they had before, where they're not going to be able to have decisions that are made that are unbiased, and instead they will just go along with the party.
Well, this questioning of electoral integrity, it seems to be not just an American trend. It appears to be drifting from democratic rule to autocratic rule around the globe. I mean, we had Trump in America, we had Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, Netanyahu in Israel. We have dictatorships in Russia, Belarus, China, much of Africa, and nations in Latin America. I mean, from your view, and you travel all around the world on this issue, where are we heading?
Well, and you missed one, because now AMLO, which is the shortened name that they have for the president in Mexico, has done exactly that. He has
you're talking about Obrador, President Obrador in Mexico.
Lopez Obrador. And what he has done, because he has a majority from his party, which is the Morena party in Mexico, in the Congress, he managed to dismantle the Electoral Authority, which was an independent federal authority that was incredibly democratic, about how they were assuring that everyone had a right to vote and that it was not just a single party rule. And now he has tried to undo that, and has pretty effectively. But I will say that I was recently in Mexico, and the day before there were over 100,000 people who were in the central square,
I saw that,
objecting to what the president was suggesting, because he too is an autocrat.
Let me ask you, we've been dwelling on the negative.
Yeah,
Is there
easy.
something, is there something positive out there? Freedom, democracy on the rise in any nations around the globe? I mean, we have seen mass demonstrations like you just mentioned in Mexico. There have been mass demonstrations in Iran over the hijab, in Israel, in China over the COVID crackdown, and here in America when Roe versus Wade was struck down.
Yes. And those are positives. I mean, we know in America, there were places such as Kansas, for example, where there were 40% more women who registered to vote in the election in 2022 because of Roe versus Wade, this decision by the Supreme Court. So it's not as if everyone is just accepting this autocratic and undemocratic country. People are standing up for what our beliefs are, and that I think is a positive.
They do stand up, but for how long? That's a problem. I mean, you had mass demonstrations in Iran, it seemed, for a couple, 3 weeks, and now they've dissipated. They've hung a bunch of people, they've arrested thousands of people, and they suppress it. And you know, kind of final thought, it's one thing to have voter suppression, and it's another issue when people don't turn out to vote. And more than 158 million people turned out for the 2020 election, which was monumental. But according to the Pew Research Center, that's only 62.8% of people of voting age actually came out to vote. So 1/3 of Americans are not voting, and that ranks us 40th among nations. Why don't more Americans vote?
Well, I think part of the reason is that I've heard a lot of people saying that their vote doesn't count. And it doesn't count because there is so much money in politics that is given by multimillionaires or billionaires so that they can have influence over the elected officials. And a lot of young people are not in agreement with that and don't think that voting is going to make a difference. But I think it's true across the board. A lot of people do not believe that their vote is a single vote and counts and will make a difference, which I think is a problematic thing for us without any doubt about it.
And then we have Citizens United, where you can't even see where the money's coming from. And a corporation is considered a person, and they are entitled to privacy and security. And I mean, as long as that exists, as long as you don't know where the money's coming from, we don't have a fair, free election.
That is true, because the money that it goes, which is called dark money, goes from wealthy people to 501c3s or C4s, mostly C4s, and other PACs. And because of Citizens United and because of the law, they do not have to disclose who their donors are. Whereas if you donate to a candidate directly, that needs to be disclosed. And that problem of lack of transparency is really significant, because you may not realize this, but in the 2022 election, adding both state races, state ballot measures, as well as the federal races, there was, hard to believe, $17 billion spent.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And Citizens United was passed, allowed to become law by the U.S. Supreme Court. And the court is even more partisan today than it was when Citizens United was passed. We've got a 6-3 partisan Supreme Court. So they're not going to turn this around.
No.
And they're going to back this up, and they're going to back up additional cases that come to court to allow this process of, I don't know, creeping autocracy to come our way.
Right. Well, and even worse, what a lot of people don't realize is a lot of money was spent by those same people, those same PACs, those same billionaires to influence Congress's decision about saying that those people should be selected as Supreme Court justices. So those six all got the benefit of money that was spent, and several of them have then, when once they were ultimately nominated and once they were already determined that they could sit as Supreme Court justices, they nonetheless are going to events with those right-wing groups that gave money to support them.
And we've got now 6 justices on the Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice, who are all appointed by Republicans. And I think that Clarence Thomas is the oldest. He's 73. So this group could be there for close to another generation.
Yes, they can. And there's a lot of people who are suggesting that there should be additions to the court, that it unfortunately, because of its composition now, it is clearly political. And a majority of the American people who have been asked about this believe that that's the problem. They do not think.
You're not going to be able to add justices, though, if you can't have a 2/3 majority in the U.S. Senate, and the Senate is equally split. So,
that's right.
Do you fear for democracy in America?
I do. I worry about it a lot, because this is a subject that I think is so important, is our democracy. And having grown up during the time period where we really had trust and faith in the Supreme Court, in even Congress and the Senate, we now don't. And that is really a concern, because how this is going to change is hard to predict, if it will change at all.
I mean, I'm just so amazed, when you watch that video of the attack on our Capitol, where you literally had thousands of people marching to take over the Capitol and do harm to our representatives.
Right.
And the vice president had to be hustled out of there because they wanted to deny us the right to have the electoral votes counted, which is part of our government. I don't believe in the Electoral College necessarily, but people are now looking at this and saying, oh, they were just there touring the Capitol, just taking a little visit to the Capitol.
Right. That's absurd.
It's repugnant.
It is repugnant.
It's just, it hasn't happened since the British invaded the Capitol in the War of 1812.
Right. It's interesting, back to my experience in Latin America, because I was there observing an election sometime close to after the January 6th insurrection. And the other observers who were there, who were from all over Latin America, said, this can't be true. The United States was always the beacon of democracy.
Right.
And they could not believe it. And they have never had incidents such as that in their countries.
Is there a way to turn it around? I guess the only way to turn it around is a massive upheaval of voters across the country, basically turning this Republican revolt around.
Right. Well, I think it partly has to be that, but it may not just spring up naturally for that to happen, because of the number of people who are part of the division in our country and part, so it might be difficult. I personally think that we have to also think very carefully about how to deal with the media, because media now gets spread more when it is the most virulent
Mhm.
and angry,
Mhm.
because those people who are uh, trying to undo voting, trying to go after the voting officials who want to, and partly this comes from Trump, who sort of acceded to violence in
Right.
our country, in our politics. That needs to change, and it can only change to some degree if we have more honest media and less of the spreading of this kind of vitriol.
The lies and the conspiracy theories. I mean,
Exactly.
it's enough to drive you insane. And but
Mhm.
there's really no control over what these people say. They call them hosts now. They're not journalists. It's opinion shows, not news. And until that turns around, and until there's some kind of regulation, and I don't see that happening, we're going to be going down this path, it seems to me, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we need to find ways to change that.
Well, we
Uh,
could do that. I mean, there is FCC control over broadcasters, but not over the cable networks. And you and I could talk about this forever, but we are running out of time. And I'd like to revisit this critical issue of voting rights in the future, because we are headed towards this very crucial election in 2024. Thanks so much for taking your time with us today and to share your thoughts on voting rights.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I think you and I have the same passion about voting rights and how absolutely essential they are to our country.
We do. And our deep thanks to Ann, the former chair of the Federal Election Commission in Washington, D.C., and the chair of the California Fair Political Practices Commission for joining us today. I'm Jim Paymar, and you have been listening to The Big Shift, available wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening today, and stay tuned for the next episode of The Big Shift, coming soon. Stay tuned.